Perfect.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So hi everyone. Thank you for attending and thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation today. So as I was telling Derek here, my presentation is called Becoming an OSS Champion, the top 3 things you can do to avoid the pitchforks. So let's get right to it. So the first thing I want to talk about is just a quick introduction. I've been at Sonatype for about 2 years, working in the customer success engineering team. And if you're wondering what we do, is we work with customers to achieve their desired outcomes with the Nexus platform. So this means we work through technical questions on how to deploy the tool set, but also how to enact change within the organization. A lot of our challenges that our customers face are not technical, but really a matter of people and processes. And as part of these, we do workshops, training sessions, and things like that. And today's session is kind of a very short version of a workshop we conduct, which is called a Champions Workshop. And the last bullet point tells a little about my background. So let's talk about governance, right? And what do I mean by governance? And what my talk is going to talk about today is things you can do to make sure that it's adopted, that it's not frowned upon, it doesn't become something like this, right? Where people just kind of laugh about it. Yes, something we really just talk about, but we really don't do, right? So what do I really mean by OSS governance? It's worth noting that when I'm talking about OSS, I should probably define that a little bit. We talk about open source software. Specifically, we're talking about open source libraries, frameworks, dependencies that your software uses today. I'm not talking about software tools that you download from the internet to use. This is the actual components that developers use in developing their software for your organization. So OSS governance is really around the set of policies that allow you to track the use and compliance of those open source components in your software, in your organization. This deals with the processes around approval and control, making sure that you are not releasing vulnerable things into your production environments. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, why do we want to do this? What's the point? Well, open source by definition means it has a license associated to it. And licenses have obligations. And by you using those components, you're in effect agreeing to those licenses. So you want to make sure that you're not using components whose obligations say you must disclose your source code, because that means now you have to disclose your proprietary algorithm, or now you have to pay a sum of money to the author of those open source components. So you want to make sure that you know what licenses these components have, because you don't want to agree to something you may not be willing to comply with. And of course, there's a security aspect to it. And that has become way more important recently. When we first started our company, especially around the lifecycle product, a lot of the focus was on licensing and license compliance. But as we've seen in the headlines with data breaches all over the place, that has become front and center. So that's also a good reason why you may want to have an open source governance at your organization to prevent software data breaches. And what we've seen recently is malicious activity, like in the EPM ecosystem with Event Map and Event Stream, where contributors are purposefully inserting malicious code into these packages to basically make money. So notice in my title, I talked about OSS governance and how to avoid the pitchforks, right? So what do I mean by the pitchforks? Well, the pitchforks, I'm talking about disruption. When you implement a process and it's disruptive, those that are being disrupted will come to you and complain and rebel, right? And they'll come with the pitchforks at you, demanding answers and put it back the way it was before, right? So how can we do things to prevent this? Before I get into my 3 things, I do need to give credit where credit is due. And my inspiration for my talk came from reading a great book that if you don't have, you should get it right now. And that is The Epic Failures in DevSecOps. And one chapter that really rang true for me was chapter 3 by DJ Schleen on the problem with success. I'll give you a quick synopsis of what that chapter is about. DJ talks about the process that he put in place where they implemented security scanning tools in their pipeline. And all their planning was about the implementation of the tool. They did not plan for what would happen or what they would do after the implementation. And all what happened once they started to do security scanning and started to failing builds, and then, of course, the developer tribe got very upset and came at them with pitchforks. And it rang very true for me because I hear that very often with our customers. As those of you that use Lifecycle, you have features, for example, that allow you to block a build. So if you just start blocking builds without any notification, that can be very disruptive. So how do you avoid that? So that's what I'm going to get into now. We're going to talk about the 3 things to help you ensure that when you put this type of tooling and processing in place, they will be adopted. They will not be worked around, or they will not be avoided. Before we get started, I'm going to keep talking about the 3 things, but one last thing I want to talk about, because I will reference this as we go through the 3 things, and that is the phases that we recommend our customers to go through as they implement a tool like Lifecycle, which usually is part of a greater OSS governance or digital transformation type processes. So when it comes to making sure that your applications are compliant with your OSS policies, the first step is always discovery. And by discovery, we mean find out how do you build software? How do you deploy software? How is the software written? What kind of tooling is used, right? Once you understand that, then the next step is to take an inventory of all the applications that you have. When I talk to customers and I ask them, well, how many applications are we going to in scope here? I never get a straight answer. It's always, well, maybe they know how many they will start in a pilot, but they never know how many applications are in the organization. Nobody ever knows. It's amazing to me. But take inventory the best you can as to how many applications you have in your organization, so you can start figuring out which ones you may want to tackle first. Next is to come up with your policy. What's the policy for your organization when it comes to open source software components? What we always tell customers is, who is the person responsible for accepting the risk, right? If we're going to deploy something with a high security vulnerability and something happens, right? Who is that responsible? Who can accept the risk of possibly putting something out there that may cause a data breach, right? Once you have your policies in place, then the next step will be to do mitigation. Those are your plans around how to address those possible violations of your policies. And the last piece is enforcement. And that's when we get to talk about, for example, may prevent a deployment into production based on a policy violation. Or as my colleague Chris Carlucci talked about earlier, when you may want to block things from coming in through something like firewall. So those are the 3 phases that we always guide our customers through into implementing our tooling and OSS governance. And I know you're probably already tired of me talking about things. You just want me to get to my 3 things. So let's start. So first, I'm going to name you the 3 things, and then we'll deep dive into each one. So the first one is communicate. Number 2 is actionable findings. And the number 3 is organizational philosophy. So now let's deep dive into each one. So the first one I mentioned is communicate. And this is the one where we probably will spend most of the time. The first thing you want to do is communicate intent. What do I mean by that? Before you start developing your policies or the processes that you're going to put in place, it's very important that you communicate to the greater organization what you're trying to achieve. Now, I do not mean that you copy everybody in the company, every single employee, and make an announcement, right? You probably already are aware of some of the stakeholders, but you may want to communicate what you're trying to accomplish and invite anybody who has a stake in this to come to the table. You may find out that somebody may respond and say, hey, I think Joe in this department, he probably will want to know that. So by communicating to a set of stakeholders, they may know other stakeholders that will want to be involved in the process. So you invite them to the table, you learn from them about their processes, what they do, their perspective, and of course, you want to take their input in coming up with a process. By taking their input into account when you set up your policies, you'll minimize the type of disruption that can happen when you set up your policies in a vacuum and don't take anybody else's input into account. So first of all, let's make sure we get everybody to the table. Next is, once you have a process in place and have the tooling to go with it, you want to make sure that you're supporting the adoption. So it's very important that you set up a wiki page. This wiki page or pages can explain the requirements for driving the adoption. Why do we want to do this, right? The importance of it. Well, we want to prevent us from being hacked, right? We want to make sure that our customer data is not stolen, right? what the toolings that you're putting in place, why are they important, how they're going to play, how they benefit the end user. And specifically when it comes to our tooling, some of the things that we encourage our customers to document are things like, what's the URL to log into, right? Am I using my single sign-on? Am I using my LDAP credentials? How do I log in, right? If there's a problem, who should I contact? And lastly, around tooling, if it's integration points, you want to make sure that they also have directions on how they can get their tooling integrated with the process. And lastly, your policies need to be documented. You want to make sure that if people have questions or they want to learn a little more about why a policy is in place or what it does, what its purpose, you want to make sure you document that and as well any mitigation plans. Also, you will want to make sure that you communicate expectations. We want to make sure that you communicate what's going to be acceptable at which point in the life cycle of the software. So for example, going back to life cycle, I mentioned you have the ability to, for example, to fail a build, or you may want to fail a deployment based on a policy violation. You have to decide at which point you want to do a warning versus a prevention of maybe fail a build or prevent a deployment. And you want to make sure that you're communicating those expectations. For example, you may want to allow buildings to happen, builds to continue, regardless of policy violations. But you want to set the expectation that certain violations will not be accepted in a deployment into a production environment. So you set those expectations early that certain things, while may be allowed in the build phase, will not be allowed into a pre-production or a production environment. You also want to make sure that you're notifying those violations as early as possible. That will give the developers time to research, fix the issue, and maybe request waivers. The one thing about waivers, more of a side note, waivers should really be the exceptions. If you are constantly given waivers and allowing folks to request waivers and accept them, that's going to be the expectation. That, that's okay, I'll just get a waiver, who cares? So make sure that waivers are really only on specific exceptions. And of course, back to the wiki. Everything should always be documented in the wiki. We also want to communicate the resolution process, right? Sometimes there may not be an obvious resolution. So there has to be a process for that. And you want to make sure that communication process is, if I'm using a license that right now is in the blacklist, right? But I really want to use it. I really need to use this component. Who do I go talk to, right? Who in legal usually is somebody that I would talk to for this, right? Who that person is. If I want to request that the policy, maybe the policy is catching things that it shouldn't, who can I provide that input to? If I need to ask for a waiver, again, should be an exception, right? Who should I go to? Where do I submit that request? What information do I need to reply or include in that request? Continuing on with the resolution process, what I've seen many customers do is they will, in advance, before even doing the rollout, they'll start scanning their applications and start to catalog those common components that are used in their organization, specifically those that are the most widely used and that they are the most vulnerable or have the biggest risk to the organization. This is usually a framework, something like Spring. And what they do is to start to document those components, and they do the research ahead of time, and they put them in the wiki. So it's very easy for developers to say, okay, is this library? My expectation is that I do this, right? It makes it very easy for the developers to know exactly what to do. And also they will indicate the expected time to fix certain things. This is also dependent on the applications. So what I'll also see done very successfully is a rating system for the applications. Which ones are the highest risk? Well, this one is accessible by our customers. Anybody can access this application. Well, that's top of the list right there, right? On the other hand, I have this one that you have to be in our VPN inside of our firewall to access. So while still important, it's not as high priority as the other ones. And based on that, you can determine the appropriate time to fix based on the application rating and based on the severity of the risk of those components. So that is about communication. Number 2 is actionable findings. And what I'm referring to actionable findings is you do not want to overload your end users with data, right? I think in the first presentation today, this morning from Helen Beale was about, we can only retain, small pieces of information, right? If you overload somebody with information, it's hard to know what to do. And similarly applies to here. If you give a software engineer 20 things that they have to fix and they have to do it by tomorrow, well, good luck with that, right? So cater your policy in a manner that highlights the must-fix things, right? And it's something that you can do gradually. First, we may want to address the highest risk. Once we do that and eliminate that, then we can attack lower risk. So for example, through a policy process, you may want to first focus on, based on the CVS score of the vulnerability. So first we address the highest vulnerabilities, and then we work our way down. Or you may want to use something like our grandfathering feature, which allows you to first focus on new violations and then slowly work your technical debt on the existing risk. The other thing is with our policies, you can use a color mechanism, right? To decide what's really the thing that you have to fix. So sometimes something is red, that means it's mandatory, you have to fix it. If it's yellow, that's maybe you should fix it. We recommend it, but you don't have to. And blue is mainly usually informational, something that is just for your knowledge, but no action is needed. And one graphic that we use in our workshops, which I love because I think it shows the problem is like this, right? If I show you this, what do you do first? How do you prioritize if everything's red? It's very hard to do. It's almost impossible. But if instead you do something like this, where only the most important things are highlighted, then you know, okay, I'm going to attack the red first. It's only 2 things. Okay, I can manage that. That orange one is probably also something I'll get to, but we'll see, but I'll try to. And the other blue ones, okay, well, for now, we'll ignore, right? And once we take care of the red and the orange, maybe eventually we'll change our policy. So some of this stuff may also become red. And eventually, we're working and tackling this massive technical debt. So that's what I mean by actionable findings. Last but definitely not least is organizational philosophy. So you have to take into account your organizational culture, the philosophy that you want to implement. And what we usually see are 2 different philosophies that are kind of at odds with each other. You have the support and guide philosophy, and there you have the scan and skull philosophy. We would strongly recommend, I would strongly urge you to go with the first one, the support and guide. Because the support and guide philosophy is something that allows to empower developers, makes them feel a part of the process. You're giving them information early and upfront, and they're part of the solution. Developers want to do the right thing, right? I have never met a developer that says, oh, yeah, I want to introduce some bad code, yeah, right? No, they want to do the right thing. But if it's more of a scan and skull, make them feel bad and yell at them, why did you put this in the application? Then they're going to be defensive and they're going to want to work around the process. So avoid the scan and skull. Please head towards the support and guide philosophy. Also, once you get into the enforcement, you have to look at your culture and your maturity, right? For example, the warn early fail rate is a common example that comes with culture and maturity. Some organizations, especially from the security tribe, they may want to fail the bill right away. Oh, let's fail the bill. If it has a vulnerability, I don't care. Let's go ahead and fail it. Well, maybe that's not the culture of your organization. Maybe the culture is to innovate. So you may want to allow builds to continue. But like I mentioned earlier, you want to just warn, let them know that, hey, there's some vulnerabilities we want to make sure we address before we do a deployment, right? And that's when you will fail late in the process. Also, you want to promote good component selection, either through an IDE integration or through other mechanisms, the ability to allow them to see which components are risk and which ones are good to use. And again, maybe coming up with a list of those components that are quote unquote acceptable or the standard for the organization. As our CEO, Wayne Jackson, said during his keynote, what do you want 30 login frameworks, right? There's one login framework, a specific version that's going to be used by our organization, and that's the one you should be using. So promote good component selection. Now, since we are doing pretty good on time, I thought that might happen. I'm going to have a bonus. Ta-da! A bonus thing you can do. And that is automate where applicable. Why would you want to automate? Because you don't want to become the bottleneck. Let me give you an example. Many companies, many organizations have processes for approving the use of new open source components. Some don't have any processes, but some do have a process, which is good, but it's a manual process. Sometimes it's a paper-based process. Almost hurts to say that. Where a person gets a request to use a new library, that person then, when he or she gets to it, downloads the dependencies, researches each one, looks at their vulnerabilities or licensing, and 3 months later, you get a thumbs up or thumbs down. Well, if it's that long of a wait, they're just going to work around you. By the time you get that approval or denial, you've already downloaded, it's already in use, it's too late. So that's a case, for example, where Nexus Firewall can be used with policies to ensure that approval process is quick and automated. That way you get out of the way. Another example was the review of bill of materials. Well, before we release the software, I need a list of the bill of materials. I'm going to list of all the vulnerabilities, and I'm going to take each one by one, do my research, and then I'll get back to you if we can allow to release that. Well, that's going to stifle innovation. So with a policy process, and you can automate that, you can really automate the go, no-go process of a release. If it passes your policies, boom, it goes out. If it doesn't, you fail it, and it doesn't go out the door. So those are my 4 things that you can do to ensure to avoid the pitchforks. By doing this, you'll ensure that, A, by communicating to all stakeholders, by ensuring that everybody knows the expectations, everybody knows the processes, you've involved in the processes so they have a stake in it, you'll guarantee that those affected by those decisions will not revolt, will not be disruptive, and will not come at you with the pitchforks. So by all means, please hold your head high, because by doing these things, you will be an OSS champion. If you have any questions, I will be hanging out in the Slack room. So if you have any questions, please let me know. This is the end of my presentation.